Welcome, everyone. Today is June 30th, and here we are with Tom Ryan and Barbara Engelhardt, his wife. I'm Kevin Ryan, his son, and here are some of Tom's memories. And today's topic is wartime part-time jobs. Tom?
Yes, during World War II, I was a paperboy, and I was at 10 years old. I took over a paper route. At first, I delivered the Chicago Tribune in the morning, and I had to get up at the crack of dawn, and my father would remind me that he got up at the crack of dawn and milked cows when he was in school, so I could certainly do that. But I'd rather have an afternoon route. So I soon switched over to the afternoon route, which was the Waukegan News-Sun. And it was supplied by the Perrott brothers, who contracted with the newspaper, and they had to supervise over 100 paper boys all over Waukegan. And we were between 10 and 14 years old. And you can imagine what a job those grown men, the Perrott brothers, did. But their older Perrott brother got through law school doing that, and he'd come every once in a while. He'd show up at the newspaper office, all dressed up, and just looking around, see how things were going with his two younger brothers. So they would wrap the papers, count the papers, write in a marker on the top sheet whose route it was, and then they'd tie it together with a wire machine that would be really tight and with a wire. And then they put those in a truck and they drive down the main street, throwing them out the side of the truck onto the sidewalk at usually little grocery stores. And we got ours at the corner of Washington and Buttrick Street, 2 blocks from the house, and several routes would just be designed to start there. And we'd all open ours together. And we had a little round wire cutter that was about as big as a silver dollar, and it had cuts in it. And we'd put that cut into the wire back and forth, and bang, the wire would pop out and the papers would be free. Then we'd count them to see that it was a fair count, because if we didn't have enough papers, we'd have to go and buy one for a nickel at the store and deliver it. And we didn't want to get shorted on our papers. Then we started rolling them, and we had to roll them up and then tuck the paper together in such a way that it would not fall apart when we rode down the sidewalk and threw the paper through the air, and it landed right on the porch. At least that was the goal anyway. And a lot of homes had porches in front of their house because there wasn't any air conditioning. And on hot nights, they would sit out on the porch, and all up and down the block, people would socialize from their porches. And so if I could get the paper on one of that big porch, that wasn't too hard to do. And I got pretty good at it. Once I threw one and it went through a window and broke it. And I had to pay for the window, but only once did that happen. And so you had to have a good arm, and it was really good practice for throwing things, because you were moving on the bike. And as you moved, you pulled out a paper and threw it. I had about 100 papers. And the people paid 15 cents a week for their paper. And I had to collect the money on Saturday from all 100 people. And when they weren't home, I had to come back and catch them, try to catch them when they were home to get their 15 cents. Very seldom would they pay me, say, a whole month at a time. So I only had to go there once a month. So it was a tough job and bad weather and so on, but it was great training for learning responsibility. And I enjoyed it. And I had my own money that way. My folks let me keep the money. A lot of kids had to share the money because it was the Depression and their families didn't have enough money to go around. And they got the job to help support their own families. And even though they only got to keep about $3 a week, I think is all that the paperboy got for delivering 100 papers every day for 6 days a week.
Now,
I did that.
During the winter, though, during the winter, you'd have a lot of snow and everything. How would you ride around on the bicycle in the snow?
Yeah, then we'd have a sled, and we'd put the papers on a sled and walk the route. And it took it was harder. And we had to be more careful with the paper that it didn't get wet. And people treasured their paper because almost everybody on my route, every house got a paper. There were only a few that were so fussy, they stopped at the store and paid a nickel every day to get the paper earlier and dry and not ripped, and they'd take it home and read it right away. And so I didn't get them as customers. But every time I got a new customer, somebody moved, a new one came in, I get a free movie ticket. So from the Perret Brothers, and I could take that to the movie theater and get in free. So there were little perks like that. Sometimes we'd have parties for the paper boys, and they'd feed us, hot dogs and so on, and then we'd have a contest who could roll papers the fastest. So I get picked to come up in front with two other older paper boys, and they'd give us maybe 10, 20 papers, and we'd roll them up really fast, and then, of course, we had to throw them on the floor because if they fell apart and didn't hold up to fall off the table onto the floor, then they weren't wrapped properly.
Okay,
And
did you do the trifold or the eightfold?
No, it was always the long. When it got through, it was about a foot long.
Yeah,
and tucked in.
Yeah, like that.
I don't know how they do it in Japan. I wonder if they have a different kind of.
Well, I was a paper boy too.
Oh, you were a paper boy too. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's right.
So when World War II began, in the middle of that, everything changed. The guys went off to war, and Rosie the Riveter, of course, went in and worked and took over some men's jobs. But there were a lot of high school boys that would finish high school at 3 o'clock and go to work on the second shift, 3 to 11, and then go home after working hard and get some sleep and then go to school the next day. And so we had a lot of high school kids that were working full-time jobs, so that their families, it was a boom time and a shortage of labor rather than a depression where you couldn't get a job. So paper boys were quitting to work in grocery stores and so on. So they had to do something to make it easier for the paper boys. And one of them was to have the newspaper collect the money, 15 cents a week, and have people subscribe. But the newspapers were afraid to do that they'd lose customers, and people would go to a competing newspaper. There were Chicago papers they could get. And so they were, but they had to do it to get paper boys. So I was still a paper boy through the beginning of that, and I got $4 a week without any collecting. And the collecting was really a nuisance. You collect nickels and dimes, and then you took them home in a bag and you counted them and made sure you had enough to pay your bill on Saturday. And then whatever was left was yours. And it may have been only a few dollars, but it was mine. And I could buy any kind of, I bought a movie projector once. It was a 8mm movie projector with the money I had saved up. So I learned how to handle money and what it was worth and what you had to do to get it. I really appreciated the newspaper. At the end, they hired me when I got into high school. The newspaper would send papers all over the world to the GIs who were stationed, and even some civilians that had gone to war jobs in other cities where they got better jobs. And they wanted to find out what was happening in the old hometown. So we would roll up the paper in a wrapper with an address on the label, and then glue it together, and then take all those newspapers down to the post office and mail them all over the world. And I did that for couple of years and made friends with the other paper boys that rolled those and with Mr. Oliver. And he knew us kids because we were right there, right next to the rotary press that would shake the whole building when they printed the newspaper, the rest of the newspapers. And they were supplying Great Lakes Naval Training Station, and they were selling lots of newspapers. And the newspaper was mostly paid for with ads in the paper. So the amount of money that you paid for a subscription was just really for delivery. And that went to the paperboy. And I really enjoyed that time. And I was lucky enough to be in a boom time. And I was too young to be drafted into World War II. My father was too young to be drafted into World War I. He was just 17 when it ended, and I was 14 15 when the World War II ended.
And
Germans.
Yeah, I was same thing with the Vietnam War.
Yes, and Kevin had that experience with Vietnam.
But no, back to the newspapers. Did you get any tips?
Oh, not very often did we get tips. I mean, it was the Depression mentality. But they, at Christmas time, we gave them a calendar. And I would say, would you like to buy a calendar? I think that's why we said it. And they knew that was a way to give us a tip. And so they get the calendar and we get a tip. The most tip I ever got was $2. And he was from a guy that was a kind of a drunk that my father knew because he was a mail carrier. So I can remember him giving me $2. That was a lot of money. Very seldom was it more than $1. Anyway, that was one way. But tips, no, not I don't remember ever getting tips. I remember going to houses where they had flags in the window that showed that they had somebody from that family was fighting in World War II. And I had an aunt who had a banner like that, little flag, and it had 4 stars on it. For 4 sons were all in the armed forces. But the ones in my neighborhood, and I just had the 3 streets, my home was right in the middle of my route. So I would go around collecting. And I can remember these women would come to the door, and when I knocked and when they saw, they had the 15 cents in their hand, but they wouldn't give it to me. And they wanted to talk to me and ask me questions. And I was in a hurry to get going. Finally, they let me have the 15 cents and I'd go. I realize now that one woman, her son got killed, and she had a gold star in her window. And so she was, I think she saw me. I was maybe 14 years old. Her son was only maybe 4 years older than I was. And she was remembering her lost son. I had 2 mothers like that, gold star mothers, on my route of 100 people. And I remember that.
Yeah.
So I got to meet a lot of people. Today, I can name everybody on my street, 1 block long, Cornelia Avenue. It's funny, I can't remember people's names that I just met yesterday. And yesterday on the Zoom, I couldn't remember Ryan, my grandson's name. It just slipped me. But I can remember all the names of the people that I delivered newspapers to.
There's a Greek family.
We had Greeks on the street. We had the Betchers. They were German born, and Mrs. Betcher had a thick German accent, and they had a daughter named Irene, and she played the harp, and she would play the harp at the Philharmonic. And I could go down the street. Mr. Waldorf, he was my favorite physics teacher in high school, and I certainly remember him. And Mr. Hardy lived on the street. He was the school principal at the West Side School, elementary school. So we had quite a variety of people, and working class mostly. We were the only Catholics until Aunt Gert and Uncle Pat moved in. I think most of the people were non-church goers. They didn't attend church regularly. But we had, it was a variety, and the Greeks and the Germans were really a variety, but we didn't have any blacks, of course, or Mexicans were not allowed to live in our neighborhood. They lived in a ghetto. And I first got to go in that ghetto when I was in my 20s, still driving.
Which sounds like a great another story.
Okay.
Yeah, another episode on that one. Okay. Sounds
That's a good one. All right, we'll let it go there.
Okay.